I'm really thrilled to be joined by Laila Al-Arian. Laila Al-Arian is an investigative journalist and executive producer of Fault Lines, an Emmy and Peabody award-winning show on Al Jazeera English, and also the executive producer of an enormously powerful film called The Night Won't End, for those people who have not seen it. It's an extraordinarily powerful and haunting film. Laila, maybe I can just start by talking a little bit about your family story, where your family is from, and how it came to be that you are where you are now.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for being here. So my parents were Palestinian. My father's parents were from Jaffa. They were forcibly expelled from their homes in 1948. They both traced very long lineage in Jaffa. My mom's mother was from Jaffa as well, and like in between Jaffa and Lid, which is not far from Jaffa. And in 1948, her father was a policeman, and it's believed that one of the militias at the time, the Zionist militias, went into Jaffa where he was and rounded up any military-aged Palestinian man who had a weapon of any kind, and he was executed and put in a mass grave. So at the age of 12, my grandmother was orphaned. She walked from Lid to Gaza, very difficult walk. It was later known as the Lidda Death March, along with many other Palestinians. And my mom's father was from Gaza. That's where my mom's parents met, in Gaza. So all four of my grandparents were made into refugees with the creation of Israel and had to leave their homes. And one thing you realize growing up is that generation just didn't, it was very painful to talk about it. So I actually didn't learn about my grandmother, about her father being killed until I was 12. So it just wasn't something that they really talked about. They both ended up in different parts of the Arab world. So my mother was born in Saudi Arabia, my father was born in Kuwait, and my parents both eventually ended up in Egypt. And what's really kind of a wild coincidence is that both of my grandfathers had to leave the Gulf countries where my parents were born because they were Palestinian, but for very different reasons. So Palestinians had a very precarious, I guess, life or lives in the places where they were, after being forced out of their homes, where they ended up trying to make a home. And for my mom's dad, he was an Arabic teacher in Saudi Arabia. He learned that one of his students had been abused by a teacher. The teacher was Saudi. Because my grandfather was Palestinian, he was vulnerable. And when he spoke out about it, he was forced to leave Saudi. And then with my father's dad, he was asked to basically spy on fellow Palestinians in Kuwait. He
By the
refused,
Kuwaiti government.
I think by the Kuwaiti government or by a group that was interested in that. And he had to leave Kuwait. So that's how my parents both ended up in Egypt. And then my father ended up leaving Egypt at the age of 17, again, because of being Palestinian. He was very studious, a bookworm, and he was very, very hardworking as a high school student. He received top scores, but because he was Palestinian, he was restricted in what he could study. Hi, Hassan. And he couldn't study what he wanted to study. So his father told him, listen, I'm going to give you my life savings and just apply to universities in the US and the UK. And wherever you get in, I will support you. Palestinians very much, education is really important. It's seen as like sort of a tool of freedom, liberation, a better life. So that's how my father ended up in the US, and my siblings and I were all born in the US, but nobody allows you to forget that you're Palestinian. And of course, with what's happening now in Gaza, my mother has extended family in Gaza. She learned it back in April that more than 200 members of her extended family have been killed in the last 10 months. Of course, this was April, so we don't know what the number is now. But on a personal level, on the level of my job as a journalist, it's obviously been a very, very difficult last 9 months.
So your father went to the US for university, and your mother, how did she get to the US?
Yeah, they married. They were very young. I always say babies having babies. They were 18 and 21 when they got married. And he came to the US at 17 and went back to Egypt. He remembered my mom from high school, remembered liking her, and they married and he brought her to the US.
And where in the US did he grow up?
I grew up in Florida, Tampa, Florida. There was a Saturday Night Live skit that said like weird things happen in Tampa or Germany. Those were the two places. But I've now spent most of my life outside of Florida in the DC area mostly.
What was it like to grow up as a Palestinian American in that period in Tampa, Florida?
Well, my specific family background is very complicated. I don't think we have enough time to
Mm.
talk about it, but my father was very active. It's unique in a way for Palestinians. He was very active on the Palestinian issue. He was targeted for many years because of his activism. He was actually arrested after 9/11, tried in this very wide-ranging trial along with three other Palestinian men. Miraculously, given the environment at the time of fear and hysteria, they were not convicted, but the government went on to pursue my father for a total of 12 years before he eventually had to leave the country due to the case. It's a very long case. I'd be happy, maybe another time you could bring me
Yeah,
on to.
I know. I'm sorry. I actually am a little bit familiar with the case. I didn't put the name together, so
No,
I
it's
would love
okay.
to, that would be another episode. I would be very
Yeah,
interested.
yeah. But yeah,
So
very unusual in that sense.
So, talk a little bit about how this film was made. There's tremendous amount of footage and deep interviews of the kind, and then in the US media, one doesn't really see very much with different Palestinian families in Gaza who were terribly affected by the war. Can you just talk about what it took to actually make the film?
Yeah, it was very difficult. As you all know, international media who are not in Gaza are not allowed into Gaza, haven't been for the last 10 months. Even before October 7th, Gaza was very difficult to access because it was under siege and a blockade. So even for people with family members in Gaza, it was very difficult to get in. So we knew that we couldn't go into Gaza. We didn't know if obviously Israel's bombardment would stop at any time and that we'd be able to go in. But after a while, it became clear that it wasn't going to stop anytime soon and that we would need, in order to make this film, to work with journalists on the ground. So we worked with a production company that's very experienced, has been producing films inside and outside of Gaza for a long time, called Mediatown. And we worked with journalists on the ground in Gaza, and they're extremely talented and they worked under the most extraordinarily difficult circumstances. So everything that people of Gaza are going through, they're also going through. One of the cameramen in December saw his 5-year-old daughter be killed by an Israeli soldier in front of him as they were trying to leave their area. His name's Hussein Jabir. He was injured in his arm. Another of our cameramen actually had a leg injury that he had sustained before October 7th. So he was struggling with an injury that he wasn't able to get medical attention to. So that's something that you think about in terms of the people who aren't able to just deal with medical situations that have nothing to do with injuries or anything like that sustained during the war. They are also dealing with starvation conditions. So one of the cameramen, I was messaging with him, he said, tonight I had to share a can of beans with 9 other men. Food scarcity, grieving family members they've lost, multiple rounds of displacement, not being able to work out of an office, just communication problems. So even trying to find sources that we wanted them to interview, phone lines are down, they're just not working, very spotty and unreliable internet. So it's really, Gaza's now in the Stone Age. So in terms of just physically getting to sources to interview them, they would have to walk or take a donkey because there just isn't fuel. Whatever we hear in the media, the situation's far, far, far worse in reality. So they filmed the interviews. We did our own reporting beyond what they gathered for us in terms of speaking to sources on the phone as much as we could, or family members or relatives of people who survived or lost family members to attacks. We also filmed in the United States. We filmed with human rights organizations. You'll see in the film several of them in the UK, as well as the Secretary General of Amnesty International, Josh Paul, who resigned from the State Department just 10 days into the war. So we did our own reporting in the US. It was all over 5 months, as well as working with journalists on the ground.
Can you talk a little bit about the stories of the families that you chose to focus on for folks who haven't watched the film?
Yeah, so we decided to focus on 3 different families primarily because they represented different parts of the war on Gaza. The Salim family, we know that most of the people in Gaza are killed by destructive large airstrikes. which is why the death toll is so high. So the Salim family had been displaced from their dream home that they took years to build and renovate. And it's a family of two parents and eight children. And they were displaced to another family home. And it's also on YouTube for those asking for the link. And the Salim family was sheltering with family. And on December 11th, there was a massive airstrike that hit their building. Hiba, who's the mother in the family, her husband Ayman, and their eight children miraculously survived, but they sustained quite serious injuries, some of them, and were under the rubble and lost over 100 members of their family, the Salim family. When we took this attack to Air Wars, which is a research group that monitors civilian harm, they were able to verify that more than 100 people were killed in this attack, at least 50 children. So quite a high number of children. And Air Wars concluded that this was not an unusual attack, sadly, in terms of the high number of children and in terms of the high number of people killed. We don't know what the Israelis were targeting in this airstrike. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of transparency around that. But just a week after they survived this airstrike, the Salim family then went to a different building to shelter, and they were besieged. Again, days after they survived this airstrike, they were besieged by Israeli military vehicles. They started firing at them. For 5 days, they surrounded their building. Survivors told us they couldn't eat or drink, or they didn't feel comfortable using the bathroom even, because they felt that, any move, they could be targeted. One survivor told me they knew we were civilians. And I said, how do you know they knew that? And she said, because no one ever fought back. We were just sitting in our homes and they fired at us for 5 days straight. After the 5 days, Israeli soldiers came to their doorstep and went into the apartment building. And according to survivors, they began shooting and they shot one man point blank. And then they separated the men from the women and children. And survivors told us they proceeded to beat them, including the women and the children. And they beat the men. Uday Salim, who's Hiba's son, who's 21, told us that they brought his father, Ayman. They told him to go up the stairs and knock on one of the apartments to tell the family to come out. Ayman did as he was told. And Uday then tells us that they pushed his father down the stairs. I don't know why this one detail that they pushed this man down the stairs has just stuck with me for months since I've heard the interview. There's just something particularly brutal and dehumanizing about pushing someone down the stairs like that. They said that they punched Ayman in the face, broke his jaw. They stripped the men down to their boxers and had them go on all fours, their hands and knees. They also had the women strip their clothes. They put the women in an area where they could see the men. And they told us they then proceeded to carry out summary executions. 11 men were killed. And maybe some of you are skeptical. Maybe some of you are like, that doesn't sound plausible. The Israeli military wouldn't do that. And I would tell you that we took every step to verify that this happened. There is video of the dead bodies. There's even video of Ayman dead, and you could see that his jaw was broken. Every single person we interviewed separately had the same testimony. They were all very consistent, and there was no sign of dishonesty. We were able to show through satellite imagery that Israeli tanks were in that neighborhood when the family said they were. We also looked at text messages from that night by survivors to their relatives saying they killed all the men. Every single piece of evidence we could gather, we gathered. And we were told by survivors that they repeatedly said, we're civilians, please don't kill us. And they did anyway. And what's really upsetting is that there seems to be a pattern of these summary executions, because we learned of two others in that same general area of Gaza City around that same time in December. And yesterday, I actually saw a report that there was a fourth summary execution of a different family, the Nofel family, that involved a father being killed in front of his children who were deaf and mute. what we found in our film and our reporting is that the Israeli military is operating in such a way in Gaza. It doesn't seem like they're following any kinds of rules of engagement. In fact, reporting by 972 magazine confirms that they're basically shooting at will, that they're viewing all Palestinians and treating all Palestinians as the enemy. There's no distinction between fighters and civilians. We found no evidence that there were any fighters or combatants in that building.
Did you reach out to interview Israeli military or other officials? And if so, what happened with that?
Yeah, good question. We definitely tried to get an interview with the IDF. They declined, or I think they didn't respond. And then we sent them a long list of very detailed questions about every incident that we reported on. They didn't respond. Now, this is also the military and the government that shut down Al Jazeera and that has smeared Al Jazeera. So I guess it's not that surprising. When we made a film called The Killing of Shireen Abu Aqla about the killing of the legendary Palestinian journalist Shireen in the West Bank city of Jenin in 2022, we also requested an interview with the IDF. They also did not grant us one then. The situation for Al Jazeera has gotten far worse since then, so I'm not surprised, but we tried every effort to get them to respond to our questions. They did not.
And we had a question about whether you asked U.S. officials about this particular incident or about the Israeli rules of engagement more broadly.
Yes, we, for 4 months, requested an interview with the State Department and the White House, and they repeatedly declined, which is very disappointing because, the State Department obviously talks about press freedom all over the world all the time. And I believe part of press freedom is engaging with the press, including press that may ask tough questions. And we made it very clear that our audience, both in the United States and in the Middle East and around the world, for them, the situation in Gaza is a very important one, but they were not persuaded and they declined to give us an interview. So what we did was we ended up pulling from, a very robust archive of sound bites from John Kirby, from Matt Miller, Joe Biden, and others representing the administration to really give a sense of what they believe and what their positions are. And for John Kirby, he said that there were no instances that they found in which the Israeli military was violating international law. Now, we've seen ample evidence of that. Amnesty International told us that they have presented to the US government evidence of international humanitarian law violations, but there's also video footage of it. So Al Jazeera obtained drone footage of the Israeli military drone striking Palestinian men who were walking in Khan Yunis, clearly unarmed, just walking, and they were executed. We've seen video footage of white flag shootings. So there's ample evidence of them violating international law. And if these aren't violations of international law, I don't know what is.
Sorry, I interrupted you. You were going, I think, to tell the story of another family.
Yeah, I mean, I probably spoke in too much detail to the point where you won't want to see the film. So I'll make the other summaries very quick. But another case we looked at was the case of Abdullah al-Ghaf, a man from northern Gaza who followed the Israeli military's instructions to go south, along with his wife, Mariham, and their 4 children. Abdullah and his wife and children went to Khan Yunis, which was declared a safe zone by the Israeli military. But what he found in Khan Yunis was food scarcity as well as a lack of safety and security. One day, his 2-year-old son told him that he was hungry and that he wanted biscuits. So Abdullah went to the market to get some biscuits for his son. By the time he came back, there was a massive strike on the family apartment where they were sheltering. We don't know for sure if it was artillery or an airstrike. We think it could possibly have been both. But what we do know is that Mariham and Firas were killed. We have video footage of them on their way to the hospital, their bodies, as well as the daughters who survived. And his son Muhammad was injured in that attack and later succumbed to his injuries because of the lack of health care in Gaza. So the point of covering the Al-Ghaf case is to show that really the notion of so-called safe zones is a fictitious one. There is no safe place in Gaza. And in fact, Air Wars documented and researched the fact that Israel has repeatedly attacked safe zones. So this is something that's not even controversial by now. It's well documented. We also looked at the famous case of Hind Rajab, the 6-year-old girl who was trapped in her car along with her dead relatives who had been killed by the Israeli military as she was pleading for her life. And it's actually the most comprehensive reconstruction of what happened to Hind and her family. And that's the third family that we focus on.
I'm curious what you make of the American media's coverage of the war and of conditions in Gaza. How different do you feel like what this film captures is from what the normal US media coverage of the war is like?
Well, I would say we could be here all day, talk about the media coverage. This is 9 months of it. But I would say it kind of falls under three main categories. One is what the media is not covering in terms of the situation on the ground in Gaza and the situation of Palestinians. Two, it's what they're covering in terms of acting as stenographers for the Israeli state. So engaging in regurgitating official Israeli state narratives or talking points of the day or straight up propaganda or disinformation. And the third category is what it doesn't cover in terms of Israeli behavior. Now, again, we could be here all day, but briefly speaking, in terms of the situation on the ground for Palestinians, this is an unprecedented bombardment in the way that Israel's executing this war on Gaza. You have the largest cohort of child amputees. You have a policy of forced starvation on an entire population, a government that's cut off food, water, fuel. We learned today of reports that the polio virus has been found in the water system in Gaza. So, in addition to the starvation, in addition to the unprecedented number of medical workers killed, humanitarian workers killed, journalists killed, children killed, and these are milestones that we reached months ago. This simply is not reflected in the tone of the coverage. So every single day, there are massacres that are just not covered. I'm especially speaking about Western mainstream media. There's such a disconnect between what we see on our phones, what we see on social media, what we see on Al Jazeera, on other sources, and what we see in mainstream media sources like the New York Times or CNN. Now, of course, there's exceptions to that. I don't want to paint the entire Western media with a broad brush, but largely speaking, the story, the humanitarian crisis, the killing, the massacres are simply not reflected in the coverage. Now, as journalists, we know that it's not just whether a story is covered, it's not just how it's covered, but it's also how it's placed, the tone of the story, the tenor of it, whether there's a breaking news alert with it, the language that's used. So when it comes to coverage of Israeli actions, you oftentimes see headlines that don't attribute responsibility to Israel. Meanwhile, when Russia attacks a children's hospital, it's Russia attacks children. It's very clear, who, what, when, where, how. It's the basics of journalism. Whereas with Israel, oftentimes it's passive language. It's trying to solve a riddle of what actually happened and who did it. You also see a lack of coverage of the TikTok videos that Israeli soldiers are putting out, the war crimes that they themselves are documenting, the pillaging of Palestinian homes, the destruction of Palestinian civilian infrastructure. Just yesterday, I saw a very disturbing TikTok videos of Israelis using the screams, the guttural screams of grief of Palestinians to joke around. And in general, there's a whole genre of these videos that are being uploaded by soldiers, whether they're wearing Palestinian women's underwear, which is a very bizarre and disturbing and very much undercovered pattern of behavior that we're seeing, or wanton destruction of property, destruction of mosques, destruction of hospitals that are just simply isn't either receiving any coverage or enough coverage in terms of what's actually happening. Meanwhile, you see a regurgitation of Israeli official talking points that end up later on falling apart. So today, you may have already seen that there's a very monumental and consequent, well, I don't know about consequential, but certainly monumental ICJ decision about the Israeli occupation and settlements. Now, remember, when was the last ICJ decision? It was about that Israel is conducting plausible genocide. On that day, on that very day, the Israeli official narrative was that members of UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency that has been around since the state of Israel has been around, participated in October 7th. That UNRWA is overtaken by Hamas. All of these smears that months later, journalists actually take a closer look at, and they find that there's no evidence to support this. So again, from the very beginning, there was this official Israeli state narrative to paint Hamas as Hamas ISIS, to justify violence of the level that we've seen the last 9 months, you have to paint your enemy as a barbarian. So beyond what actually happened on October 7th, we had stories that turned out to not be true. So beheaded babies, Hamas ordering its fighters to commit mass rape, putting babies in the oven. All of these things turned out to be untrue, turned out to be lies, but you see the media kind of going with it. Also, that Hamas used Al-Shifa hospital as a command and control node. That turned out to be false. Again, that Hamas is infiltrating UNRWA. That turned out to be false. So really, the standards of journalism dropping in order to regurgitate these Israeli official state narratives. So these are sort of the three categories: what's being regurgitated and receiving, I would say, like front page coverage, what's not being covered in terms of the reality on the ground, and what's not being covered in terms of Israeli actions on social media and other places.
This is a tricky question. What do you think, given the fact that there were stories of what happened on October 7th that were disproven, and there also were clearly the killing of civilians that took place in pretty significant numbers on October 7th, and in light of the fact that since October 7th, we've now seen this killing in Gaza on a vastly, vastly larger scale. For people who believe that all human life is precious and that all civilians should be protected, what do you think the right way for the media to write about October 7th would be in a way that respects the humanity of Israeli civilians and Palestinian civilians?
Well, for one thing, I think part of the problem with the coverage is that history starts at October 7th. And we know that 2023 was the deadliest year for Palestinians in many years, especially in the West Bank. We know that Israeli settlers have been engaged in violence. The military had been engaged in violence, including killing American citizens like Shireen Abu Akleh, like Omar Assad in the West Bank. We know that there's ongoing land theft in the form of settlements and ongoing settlement building in the face of attacks by settlers. So I would say that it's dishonest and does the audience a disservice to have history begin on October 7th, because it doesn't give the audience a full picture of the situation for Palestinians. The fact that, of course, that Gaza had been under siege for 17 years, under a brutal blockade that involved calorie counting for the people of Gaza, that turned Gaza into the world's largest open air prison, that made life unbearable, that made the unemployment rate skyrocket up to 80%, that just made life unlivable for the people of Gaza. So I would say treating Palestinian life equal to Israeli life. And I think at the core of the media coverage is a devaluing of Palestinian life. It's a hierarchy of life in which Israeli Jewish life is more valuable and more precious. And I think that does everyone a disservice, because if you dehumanize one group of people, you're dehumanizing everybody ultimately.
And similarly, a lot of the conversation and discussion about Hamas does end up dehumanizing Palestinians. But Hamas still needs to be analyzed and understood in the media, discussed. It's an important political and military actor in Palestinian politics, in Israel-Palestine today. How would you say the Western media should write about and understand Hamas without whitewashing the fact that they have attacked civilians over decades and killed a great deal of them on October 7th, but without using a discussion about Hamas to dehumanize Palestinians?
Well, I think for one thing, understanding and recognizing that Israel and the occupation and the root cause of all of this, which is Palestinians being dispossessed of their land, Palestinians essentially paying the price for the anti-Semitism and the Holocaust of Europeans, and for all of these myths about the creation of the state of Israel taking place at the expense of the Palestinian people, that their dispossession, their ongoing occupation and ethnic cleansing and apartheid and genocide now, all of that predates the creation of Hamas in 1987. Before Hamas, there was the PLO, the PFLP, fill in the gap. Resistance to occupation exists because of oppression. That's it. And of course, resistance comes in many different forms. I personally, of course, oppose the killing of civilians, no matter who the civilians are. But what is happening is not happening in a vacuum. And I think the Western media refuses to even talk to Hamas as a political actor. There's almost this unspoken ban in terms of speaking to Hamas. And I think, again, that does the audience a disservice to not hear from them and talk to them because they are a party to this, whether people like it or not. They're a party to this. They were the elected government in Gaza and they run the, or ran, I don't know about now, but the day to day of people's lives in Gaza. And the Western media should also talk to them as an actor in this, but they very rarely do. And when they even speak to Palestinians who've lost family members or Palestinian academics, people like Noor Arakat or Yusuf Munayir, they speak to them as if they are an accountability interview. And Palestinians are either spoken to in terms of an accountability interview, they're
All right,
grilled,
what do you mean by an accountability interview, just for people who might not be familiar with that term?
they're asked to condemn Hamas. That's the first thing they're asked. Meanwhile, if you have an IDF official on, they're not asked to condemn, the latest massacre of civilians in Gaza. They're just asked questions. They're asked to analyze the situation. They're thrown softball questions. But either Palestinians or people who go on TV in support of Palestinian rights are often grilled, and they're grilled in a way as if they're elected officials. And this even applies to Palestinians who've lost family members. But I would say, I don't think, given the media landscape, especially in the West, I don't think the fear is that the media is going to whitewash Hamas. I think the reality is that they don't even want to hear from them.
In terms of the impact of this destruction of Gaza, you spent a lot of time talking to the reporters there, and they were spending all this time talking to these families. Are those folks at all able to envision a future beyond this cataclysm? I'm just curious, what do people talk about as they try to think about the future in the midst of this just horrendous suffering?
Yeah, I mean, we are working on more films about Gaza and the US role because my show focuses on the US role in the world. And I saw some footage from Gaza City recently, and it just looked so apocalyptic. And these cameramen shoot so beautifully. This is the show Fault Lines on Al Jazeera English. And we were following a doctor who's treating children suffering from starvation and malnutrition. And this doctor was just walking through his neighborhood, and it just looked apocalyptic. All the buildings are gone, everything is gone. And that's what people are telling us. Gaza is gone. Everything is gone. I mean, imagine the number of schools that have been destroyed, universities, mosques, hospitals, homes, residential buildings. Everything that makes and sustains life is gone. And I think the question that needs to be asked is, what is Israel's end game, right? Like, I covered the Iraq war. I didn't go to Iraq, but I spoke with soldiers and Marines in the US military that served there. And one of the things they told me is that they thought about the so-called hearts and minds campaign. How do we win the local population's hearts and minds, right? In order to get them on our side, in order to, get rid of the Baathists, get rid of Saddam's people. There's no talk of that. And of course, we know that many, many, many civilians died in Iraq. Up to 1 million civilians died in Iraq. So we know that the so-called hearts and minds campaign didn't really work in the end. But Israel is not acting in a rational way. They're not acting in a way that's going to secure Israel. And they're not acting in a way that gives the people of Gaza a future. I think it's very clear that the end game is to make Gaza uninhabitable, is to kill all that makes and sustains life in Gaza, is to try to force out the entire population of Gaza as much as possible. We know that what they're engaging in now is a thinning out of the population. This is something that Israel was engaging in before October 7th. It has a name. It's called mowing the lawn. So every few years, there were these military campaigns that mowed the lawn in Gaza that killed a number of civilians. But of course, in this case, we know that the 40,000 number has been stuck for many months, that the real number is probably far higher. You have people still under the rubble. You have people missing. You have people who aren't being counted in the official death toll because they're dying of causes that are not direct fire, but diseases, other ways. So I think people don't see a future. I think Palestinians are not going to leave their land. Of course, some people have left out of desperation, but Palestinians haven't given up for 76 years. They don't want to leave their land. I know that the Zionist talking point is, well, there's all these Arabs, just go live in an Arab country. Would you want to leave your land where you live right now and go live in some other country? No. People want to live in their land, the land of their forefathers. And I know that Israel's hoping otherwise, but people aren't going to leave unless they're forced out. And we'll see what happens with Trump if he's elected, if he's going to help facilitate the mass expulsion of more people out of Gaza, which is what we're hearing Jared Kushner's hoping for. But I think people are still trying to survive daily. One of the journalists I'm in regular touch with just messaged me from the north saying, we have no food. The food situation is unbearable. Starvation is spreading even more than before. People aren't getting medical care, all of the things I talked about already. But I think people are just trying to survive. They're not even able to grieve because they're trying to survive. I don't know that people see a future right now, given the apocalyptic images that they're surrounded by.
I'm interested in the interviews you did with the American officials, how much of a gap there is between the public statements of people in the Biden administration and what they may think privately. And I'm curious if you got a sense of that doing these interviews, if there was any anxiety or embarrassment about the kind of line that the Biden administration was putting out, or whether you felt that people really, really believed it.
The Biden administration's line about what exactly?
Basically, the idea, for instance, that the United States, that there are no U.S. weapons have not been involved in violations of international law or war crimes, for instance.
That's a good question. I mean, unfortunately, the Biden administration didn't talk to us, but Josh Paul, who resigned just 10 days into the bombardment, did talk to us. And of course, he said categorically, and he knows, having served in the State Department for decades, that that's just categorically untrue. And the main point that he and others are making is that there are multiple ways in which domestic and international law are being violated. So domestically, the US has to ensure that its weapons are not being used in a way that violates international law. And we've seen ample example that that is happening. And there's also violations of the Leahy Law, which holds that the US cannot give military assistance to units in any military that is committing human rights violations. And Josh Paul confirmed to us that they have found evidence that there are units within the Israeli military that are committing human rights violations. And we know from media reports that that report reached Blinken's desk and he didn't do anything about it. So I think all this does is really hit at the credibility of the US, at the whole system of international law that was set up in the wake of World War II. And we've seen just in the past couple of weeks that Russia has attacked a hospital in Ukraine. Just today, I think, or yesterday, they attacked a World Central Kitchen aid vehicle. So Israel's actions in Gaza are emboldening countries like Russia to do the same because they know that, well, if Israel can do it with impunity, why can't we do it? And this is creating a very scary world. As the Secretary General of Amnesty International said, they've opened the gates to hell. And everybody should be concerned about what this means for the rest of the world and for the way that other countries will now feel emboldened to act.
One of the things that I've often wondered since October 7th is just what it feels like to be a Palestinian who's not in Gaza, knowing that history could have turned differently. You could be in Gaza. I'm not comparing what's happening in Gaza to the Holocaust, but I do think that one of the things that has shaped Jewish identity in the United States for many decades has been a sense of kind of survivor's guilt in a way, that it just happened that this group of Jews happened to be in the United States when their relatives could have very easily been in Poland. I know this is a very personal question, but I'm just curious what that feels like to be a Palestinian watching what's happening in Gaza and knowing that just through historical accident, you end up being in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I think it's probably a similar feeling of survivor's guilt, feeling really helpless. I mean, this film and tweeting and speaking out and doing whatever I can do to make sure that people don't forget Gaza just feels like it's never enough. It's never enough. People, the media has moved on. It's mostly election coverage now. We see ongoing killing, maiming, torture of prisoners, every kind of human rights violation you can imagine still happening in Gaza, and it's nonstop. And it's the world's most, I would say, documented and live streamed genocide that I can think of in terms of just the sheer amount of documentation. And yet, this knowledge isn't moving enough people to stop it or to call on these governments to stop it. And that's just very psychologically really distressing. And I'm not alone. I know people are struggling with eating, with sleeping, with just going through life, with parenting, with being present for your children when you feel that not only are Palestinians being exterminated and it's being documented in this way, and yet it's still not stopping. But my own government is facilitating it. My tax dollars are facilitating this. On top of that, I'm a journalist. So I see my industry not standing in solidarity with Palestinian journalists who've been killed in such large numbers. I see my own industry engaging in media malpractice for which the only explanation can be that Palestinian life simply doesn't hold equal value to Israeli life. And that's very difficult to stomach. How do you ask the world to see you as an equal? How do you ask the world to see your humanity? It's, I don't know. I mean, that's all you can do is just plead for people to see your humanity and plead for it to stop. But even when it stops, it won't stop. I mean, the level of destruction and devastation that Israel has unleashed in Gaza, that's going to haunt us for a long time. We're going to feel the repercussions of that for a very, very long time.
On that question of repercussions, I've had two people in recent months, one a Palestinian American woman and one a kind of left Jewish friend, basically say to me, I used to support the idea of one equal state, but after this, I don't think it's possible. And in one case, they said we should have two states because people in Gaza are not going to be able to live alongside Israelis after this. I know you're a journalist, you're not a politician, but I'm just curious in a world in which people have been saying for a long, long time now the two-state solution is not possible, that people have to think in terms of one equal country. Is that still the right or realistic vision in the wake of this?
It's a good question. I struggle with it because when I see just the sheer amount of war crimes happening in Gaza, when I see testimony of point blank executions, the level of dehumanization that has happened is mind boggling. I mean, how do you get past that? How do you ask Palestinians in Gaza to forgive when they've lost so much? But I'm someone who believes obviously in the equality of all humans. And at my core, I'm a realist, but I'm also an optimist. And I would hope that we can see each other's humanity and that there could be one state one day, because I think that's a solution that gives Palestinians their rights, one state where everyone can live wherever they want to live. So if my relatives want to go back to Jaffa, they'd be able to live there. Why should someone immigrating from the US or Europe be able to live in Jaffa, but my family can't go back to Jaffa? So I think one state is the more just solution. But I think there needs to be a lot of work in terms of seeing everybody as equals and making sure that this one state treats everybody as equals under the law for that to happen realistically.
We had a comment earlier from Hillel Schenker about how difficult it was to see the film in Israel. I'm just curious if you've gotten any response from people in Israel who watched the film.
Yes, I did. It was very positive. I assume they used a VPN. I don't know, Hillel, if you tried to watch it on YouTube directly. Israel may have blocked Al Jazeera's YouTube channel. They definitely blocked the website, but I would try the YouTube link, which I could drop in the chat. But I know people in Israel have watched it and they may have used a VPN.
Hmm. And then what about the response of people who have watched it in Gaza? What response have you gotten from Gaza?
They were very moved by it. A lot of people told me, people with relatives in Gaza who are not in Gaza, they're like, we're immersed in this every single day. Our families are going through this, but it made us cry. It's been surprising to hear from so many people who see these images and hear these stories and report on this day in and day out, still be moved. And I think that's really a testament to the team, the editor, the director, the camera people who filmed it in such a beautiful way. what I didn't want is for it to feel like wallpapers, for it to feel like the videos that we see on our cell phones that are just like one video after another and just they're very impersonal. I wanted to try to restore the humanity, for people to really try to connect with these families, to see their humanity, to feel sympathy with their loss, which is so unbearable. And I'm very grateful that people have been able to see that, including people in Gaza. I think at the same time, people in Gaza feel so frustrated, they feel forgotten, they feel hopeless, they feel betrayed by the world that hasn't done anything to stop this.
Yeah, I also think one of the things the film does, which is very unusual, again, if you're getting US or Western media, is it depicts the heroism of just ordinary people in Gaza. So I think particularly the part about the people who work at the equivalent of 911, the emergency service, who got that call from his family, and then the extraordinary lengths that they went to and risked their own lives to try to get an ambulance there. I think that's something which really rarely comes through in American media. It was, for me, a very, very powerful part of the film.
Yeah, thank you. We were really grateful that we were able to kind of bring in those people's experiences, because they really risked their lives to tell their story and to say their names. I think was something that we really felt strongly about, because so many rescue workers have been killed the last 10 months. This is just one example.
Just the last question. Are there particular journalists or writers or other folks in Gaza who are writing on social media or other places that you would recommend people follow?
Yeah, I would say Bisan Auda, Bisan. She's an incredible young woman who has been documenting everything that's happening to her for a very long time, since the beginning. She makes videos that she puts out on social media. There's Mohammed Smiri, Smiri, who's on Twitter, who tweets Hind Khodari, Khoudary is her last name, Hind, is also an amazing journalist. She works for Al Jazeera English. She works for Channel 4, among others. And she's also been bearing witness and separated from her family and kind of surviving under the most difficult conditions imaginable, and covering all of these journalists have just covered massacre after massacre. I can't even begin to think what that does to your mental health, having your cortisol levels raised so high for so long, what that does to you in terms of rewiring your brain. I think, like I said, this doesn't end when Israel stops its bombardment. We're going to feel these repercussions. The people of Gaza will feel the repercussions in terms of the environment, in terms of the physical health, mental health, for a really long time.
Laila, thank you so much for doing this. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for being here.
Next week, we're going to be talking to Ayelet Waldman. Some of you may know Ayelet's work. She's a novelist and an essayist, and she wrote quite a powerful essay a few weeks ago now in New York Magazine entitled My Father and Liberal Zionism's Downfall, about her own family story and how it forced her to reckon with certain things about Israel that she had not growing up. So that'll be next Friday at 11, and everyone have a good weekend.